They were told the worst, that being captured by the Japanese was a death sentence. They had seen their comrades fall on the battlefields of the Pacific, heard the brutal stories of what awaited prisoners: starvation, torture, forced labor, death. But when the doors of the hospital finally swung open in the harsh light of the camp, what they found was nothing like the nightmares they'd been warned about. It was something far more terrifying. It was late in the morning on the 8th of May, 1944, when the train finally pulled into the station. The men had been traveling for days, packed tightly into cattle cars, their bodies worn, their minds broken. The cold was biting, more intense than anything they'd felt in the sweltering Pacific heat. They stumbled off the train, the dull ache in their legs making every step feel like a struggle. Their eyes adjusted slowly to the pale light of a morning that felt like 1,000 miles from home. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and the sight of the thick wooden hospital building ahead sent a wave of dread through their tired bodies. They had been told stories. The whispers had circled through the POW camps, passed from one man to the next. "The hospital's where they'll finish you off," they had been warned. It's better to die in the trenches than end up on the operating table. But as they shuffled through the gates of the hospital, something didn't seem right. The place was clean, too clean, and the air smelled of antiseptic and something else, a strange, lingering scent that they couldn't place. The sound of boots marching, men lined up, the cold wind that gnawed at their skin, and yet there was something ordinary about the place, something unsettlingly routine. Rows of soldiers stood at attention, their rifles at their sides, watching. But the men who had come from the battlefield, the ones who had fought so fiercely for survival, were too exhausted to care about the soldiers' stares. They moved forward like ghosts, one step at a time, their eyes on the ground. Their bodies were broken, their clothes torn, their faces gaunt from hunger and fear. But the thing that hit them hardest was the food. The smell of it, rich and strong, wafting through the air. Meat. Not the thin broth they had grown used to in the camps, but something heavy, something warm. And it wasn't just any food. It was food that felt like luxury. The guards led them to a building in the center of the compound. The hospital itself was made of sturdy wood and steel, simple yet efficient. But once inside, they were told to sit. Their uniforms, filthy and torn, were replaced with plain hospital gowns. They were given water, fresh water, the kind that tasted so sweet it almost burned their throats. Then, one by one, they were examined. The doctors, Japanese officers, and medical personnel moved around them with an air of detachment. They were professional, but cold. They measured their weight, took their temperature, checked their wounds. And though there was a strange sense of order here, nothing seemed to make sense. It wasn't the brutality they had imagined. It wasn't the cruelty they had prepared for. It was something else entirely. But as the hours passed, and they settled into the strange rhythm of the hospital, the reality began to sink in. This was no place of healing. It was a place of experiments, a place where the body was a mere vessel to be dissected and tested. The prisoners, thinking they were entering a haven of care, had unknowingly walked into a trap where they were the medicine and the doctors were the ones who would use them. The prisoners were led through a set of sterile, dimly lit hallways. The heavy smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, but there was something off about it. The doctors and nurses moved with swift precision, their faces emotionless as they went about their work. The men had been told they would be treated, healed, that their wounds would be tended to and their bodies restored. For the first time since their capture, they allowed themselves to believe it. It was a fragile hope, but it was the only one they had left. Yet, as they settled into the cold, unyielding beds, something wasn't right. There was no warmth here, no sense of compassion or empathy. just the mechanical hum of hospital machines and the relentless ticking of time. The first night, they were given a full meal, real food, the kind they hadn't seen in months. Thick, rich soup, meat, bread, and even a strange, sweet drink they couldn't identify. It was all so foreign, so different from the bland rations they had survived on in the camps. Their bodies, deprived of proper nutrition for so long, reacted with shock, but they ate eagerly, desperate for anything that would fill the gnawing hunger inside them. For a moment, it felt like they were being treated with dignity, like they were more than just prisoners. But as they lay back in their beds, a troubling thought crept into their minds. Why had they been given food like this, when their captors could have kept them starving, just as they had done in the camps? The answer, of course, was simple but terrifying. This wasn't about care. It wasn't about kindness. It was about control. The men were nothing more than test subjects, human experiments in the name of something darker, something hidden behind the sterile walls of this hospital. Days passed, and the routines became clearer. The doctors came and went, checking their wounds, taking blood samples, performing tests that left the prisoners confused and frightened. They weren't being healed, they were being used. The so-called treatments were nothing more than elaborate experiments. The hospital staff, under orders from military leaders, had no intention of helping them. Instead, they were conducting inhumane trials, tests that involved injecting unknown substances into their bodies, exposing them to extreme conditions, and even forcing them into isolation for days without explanation. When one man asked a nurse why he was being given a particular injection, she offered him only a cold, unreadable stare. There was no explanation, no reason given for any of it, just a silent assurance that they were being watched, studied, and used as tools in some twisted game of science. One of the men, Sergeant Henry Mitchell, started to piece things together. He was no fool. He had seen enough cruelty, enough suffering, to know when something was off. Late one night, as he lay awake in the dim light of his hospital room, he overheard a conversation between two doctors in the hallway. They spoke in hushed tones, their words cold and clinical, discussing the success of an experiment that had been carried out earlier in the day. Mitchell's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. They weren't just treating their injuries. They were testing biological agents, chemical warfare, and other unspeakable experiments on them. The food, the care, it was all a facade, a carefully constructed illusion designed to keep them docile, to keep them from realizing the horrors they were being subjected to. And in that moment, the weight of it all hit him. The men were not patients. They were nothing more than subjects, and their lives, their bodies, had no value beyond that. The hospital did not heal. It consumed. Inside its walls, medicine was no longer about saving lives, but about serving the empire. The doctors moved like soldiers, their white coats as crisp as their discipline, their hands steady not from compassion, but from certainty. To them, the body was not sacred. It was a resource, a tool, a thing to be opened, studied, and discarded once its purpose was complete. They had been trained in a new kind of medicine, one twisted by the spirit of war. The lessons they learned were not about care, but control. They were taught that the human body, even a living one, could be used for the advancement of science, for the strength of the nation, for victory at any cost. The prisoners soon discovered what that meant. They were given numbers instead of names, tags instead of identities. They were marched into the operating rooms one by one, their faces pale, their steps unsteady. The air inside the surgical chambers was thick with the smell of alcohol and metal. The light above the tables was blinding, washing everything in a sterile white glare. The doctors did not speak to the prisoners. They spoke to each other, their voices calm and detached, discussing organs, blood flow, infection rates. To them, these men were not soldiers, not humans, not enemies even. They were anatomy lessons. The first time it happened, the others didn't believe it. A man named Thomas was taken in for what he thought was surgery on his leg, a wound that had festered since his capture. He never came back. The next morning, whispers spread through the barracks. Someone had seen his body, pale and lifeless, covered by a thin sheet, his chest sewn shut with black thread. The rumour was that the doctors had opened him alive, cutting him without anaesthesia to study infection and blood loss. No one wanted to believe it, but deep down they knew it was true. The doctors documented everything. They recorded the effects of starvation by rationing food to almost nothing, then watching how long the body could endure without collapsing. They measured fever, infection, decay. They injected diseases into the prisoners' veins to study how quickly the human body broke down. Each day became a lesson in how war stripped humanity down to its most brutal form. Even the nurses, once thought to be symbols of kindness, followed orders without question. Their eyes were cold, their movements mechanical. To refuse an order was to betray the emperor. In another room, a doctor performed what he called a lung exposure. He sliced open a prisoner's chest to observe how long a person could breathe when one lung was removed. The patient screamed at first, then went silent, his body jerking under the restraints. The doctors took notes, as if studying a textbook. They were proud of their precision, proud of their control. By the end of each day, the halls of the hospital were quiet again, the screams replaced by the distant hum of generators and the soft tapping of typewriters as reports were filed. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the ground in silence. Inside, the work continued. It was the anatomy of war, where the line between doctor and executioner had vanished completely, and the prisoners realized the truth that no one dared to speak aloud. They were not being cured. They were being studied, piece by piece, until nothing human remained. By the middle of 1944, the prisoners had begun to understand what the hospital truly was. It was not a place for healing. It was a battlefield hidden behind clean walls and white coats, a war fought in silence, where the weapon was medicine itself. Each day began the same, the sound of boots in the hallway, the echo of keys turning in locks, the smell of disinfectant filling the air like smoke. But what happened behind the closed doors of the examination rooms was something that no man could prepare for. The doctors had become soldiers of a different kind. They did not carry rifles. They carried syringes, scalpels, and clipboards. They believed that pain could be measured, that suffering could be turned into data. To them, the body of a prisoner was nothing more than material for progress. The experiments became more precise, more cruel. Some prisoners were injected with unknown substances that burned through their veins like fire. Others were kept awake for days under bright lights until their minds began to break. A few were locked in small freezing rooms where they were told to stay still while doctors recorded how long it took for their bodies to tremble, to lose warmth, to collapse. Each test was explained as necessary, every scream justified by the promise of discovery. The doctors spoke of duty, of loyalty, of sacrifice for the empire. They believed that studying the human body under extreme duress would give Japan an advantage in biological warfare. Disease was no longer something to cure. It was something to control, to weaponize. Sergeant Mitchell was one of the first to see the patterns. He noticed that the men who had been given injections would begin to shake violently after a few hours, their skin turning pale and blistered. Some developed fevers that no amount of water could cool. The guards would come at night, carrying the bodies away before dawn, leaving the beds empty by morning. The nurses never spoke of them again. When Mitchell asked one of them what was happening, she only whispered, "For the Emperor," before walking away. That was the answer to everything here. For the Emperor, for the nation, for science. It became clear that no one in the building saw them as men anymore. They were experiments wearing human faces. Some prisoners tried to resist. They refused injections, refused food, refused to be touched. The guards answered with silence and starvation. After a few days, hunger would do the work that fear could not. Men who once fought bravely on battlefields now begged for scraps of food, for a sip of water, for mercy that never came. The worst part was not the pain, it was the waiting. Every sound in the hallway could mean your turn had come. The clink of metal, the sound of the door opening, the voice of a doctor calling your number. That was the rhythm of life inside the hospital. Not healing, not hope, but the slow, steady dismantling of what it meant to be human. And as the weeks passed, the prisoners realized that medicine, in the wrong hands, could destroy just as completely as any bomb. The hospital was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that comes before something terrible. Snow drifted against the windows, soft and soundless, while inside the halls the men waited for their next inspection. Time had lost its meaning. Each day blurred into the next. Some prayed, some stared blankly at the ceiling, and others simply stopped speaking altogether. But that morning, one of the older prisoners began to tell a story, his voice barely above a whisper. It was about another war, another place, and the horrors that had happened long before any of them arrived here. He spoke of Nanking. The name hung in the air like a ghost. Years earlier, in 1937, the Japanese army had stormed the Chinese city of Nanking. What followed was not battle, but slaughter. Civilians, not soldiers, became the enemy. Families were torn apart, entire streets burned, and tens of thousands of people were killed. The older prisoner had been stationed nearby as a medic before his capture. He said he had seen what the soldiers had done, not in combat, but in hospitals just like this one. Doctors performing experiments on the living. Bodies used for study, for practice, for nothing more than curiosity. He said the smell of blood in the air was the same, the way the doctors spoke in calm tones, as if what they were doing wasn't monstrous, but routine. The younger prisoners listened in silence, their faces pale. They began to realize that what was happening to them wasn't new. It had been done before, perfected even, on civilians in China. That night, Sergeant Mitchell could not sleep. His mind played the old man's words again and again. He imagined the streets of Nanking, the cries of mothers, the fire, the chaos, and now this place, this hospital, following the same cruel rhythm. He began to understand that the brutality around him was not born from madness, but from belief. The Japanese doctors and officers didn't see themselves as evil. They saw themselves as loyal, serving the emperor by any means necessary. Their cruelty was systematic, taught, and justified as science and patriotism. Days later, during one of the experiments, Mitchell caught sight of a document on a doctor's clipboard. It bore a symbol and the words Unit 731. He didn't know what it meant then, but he remembered the way the doctor's voice changed when he spoke about it. There was pride in it. He would later learn that Unit 731 was a secret military division dedicated to biological warfare. What was being done to them inside the hospital was part of something much larger. Something that had begun years ago in China and was now spreading across the empire. One evening, a Japanese orderly, younger than most, lingered near the prisoners' quarters. His eyes looked hollow. When one of the prisoners asked him if he knew what had happened in Nanking, the orderly froze. After a long silence, he whispered, "We were told it was necessary." Then he walked away. The words haunted them. Necessary. That was how it began, how it always began, with men who believed that cruelty could be justified, that suffering could be a means to progress. In the days that followed, the prisoners began to refer to the victims of Nanking as the ghosts. They said the hospital was filled with them, unseen but everywhere, watching. The ghosts were reminders that what was happening had been practiced before, that humanity had already crossed the line once and was crossing it again. The men knew then that they were not just prisoners of war. They were part of a cycle that had started long before them, a cycle that fed on obedience, silence, and the belief that pain could serve a purpose. In the end, the ghosts of Nanking were not just memories of the past. They were warnings of what happens when men forget that compassion is stronger than cruelty. By the winter of 1944, the hospital had turned into something that felt more like a graveyard than a place of medicine. The air inside was thick with the smell of disinfectant and decay. The men could no longer tell which day it was or how long they had been there. Their bodies were weaker now, their skin pale, their eyes hollow. Every movement felt heavier than the last. The doctors had stopped pretending to treat them. The needles came without explanation. The injections burned. The wounds never healed. Yet somehow, in that quiet despair, something small began to stir among the prisoners. It wasn't hope exactly, but something close to it. It was the decision to fight for each other, even if it meant dying in the process. Sergeant Mitchell became the center of it. He had seen too much to believe in rescue. What he believed in now were the men around him. In the dim light of the barracks, they whispered to each other at night, trading what little strength they had left, some shared scraps of bread they had saved from their meals. Others hid their rations of water and slipped them to the sick when the guards weren't looking. It wasn't rebellion in the open sense, but it was resistance. Quiet, fragile, and human. The experiments had become more invasive. Some men were cut open and sewn shut again without reason. Others were left in isolation for days, their minds unraveling in the silence. When one man, Private Lawson, was taken into surgery and returned barely conscious, the others gathered around his bed. He whispered through cracked lips that the doctors had cut into his arm to see how long it would take the wound to rot. The room fell silent. They knew then that the doctors had gone beyond cruelty. They had become gods of pain, experimenting on what it meant to still be alive. Mitchell began organizing a quiet system of care. The men took turns watching over the weak. They shared warmth by lying close together through the freezing nights. They used pieces of cloth torn from their uniforms to bind wounds, and when medicine was out of reach, they used water and whispered prayers. For some, that small act of defiance was enough to keep going. For others, it was a reason to endure one more day. But even acts of mercy came with risk. If the guards caught them helping one another, they were beaten or starved as punishment. The Japanese officers believed that isolation broke men faster than violence, so they encouraged silence, fear, and suspicion. Yet the more the prisoners suffered, the more tightly they held on to one another. When one of the sick died, the others whispered his name as they carried him away, as if speaking it would keep him from being forgotten. One night, a young soldier named Havers gave up his portion of food to a dying man. By morning, Havers was gone too. The others said he had fallen asleep and never woken up. But in his final act, he had chosen to feed another instead of himself. It was a small victory, but in that world, small victories were everything. The revolt was not made of guns or shouting. It was made of endurance. It was the refusal to let the doctors take everything from them. Every breath, every shared crumb, every whispered word of comfort was an act of rebellion. By surviving, they were defying the system that sought to erase them. And as the winter dragged on, even the walls of the hospital seemed to sense the shift. The prisoners were not broken yet. They had learned that survival itself, in a place built for death, was the strongest weapon they had left. By early 1945, the hospital had turned into a place where death was not feared but expected. The experiments had reached their most horrifying stage. The doctors moved faster now, their notes more detailed, their orders more precise. The war outside was changing, and inside the walls of the hospital, the doctors worked with a new kind of urgency, as if trying to finish their research before the world caught up with them. The prisoners could feel it too. Something darker was coming. The air smelled thicker, the hallways colder, and the sound of screams became a constant echo through the corridors. It began with new injections. The doctors called them field tests. They said they were trying to understand the limits of the human body. In truth, they were testing biological agents meant for warfare. The men were lined up and given shots of unknown substances. Within hours, some developed fevers so high that their skin burned to the touch. Others began coughing blood, their bodies trembling with violent chills. The doctors took notes as if watching a clock tick down. They charted every symptom, every breath, every convulsion. To them, this was data. To the prisoners, it was the end. In one room, a group of men was sealed inside a freezing chamber. The temperature dropped with each passing hour, frost creeping across the walls as their breath turned to mist. The guards watched through a glass window, writing down how long it took for their bodies to collapse. One soldier, barely more than 20 years old, pounded his fists against the door until his skin split open. The doctors didn't move. When his body finally fell silent, they entered the room, checked his pulse, and marked the time. Then they began again with another man. Elsewhere, the experiments took a different form. The prisoners were exposed to poisonous gases that burned their lungs, leaving them gasping for air. Some were forced to swallow chemicals, others had open wounds treated with bacteria to measure infection. The doctors refused to use anesthesia. They said pain revealed truth, that only in agony could the body show its limits. The nurses obeyed without question, their faces pale but expressionless. A few looked away when the screams grew unbearable, but none intervened. Obedience had become survival. Sergeant Mitchell tried to keep his mind steady, but even he began to falter. He had seen men die before, but this was different. This was systematic, cold. He watched as one of his friends, Corporal Ellis, was taken into surgery. When the doctors returned his body hours later, it was lifeless, covered in stitches. Mitchell wanted to rage, to fight, but he couldn't. He was too weak, too broken. In the stillness of the night, he whispered Ellis's name over and over, afraid it would vanish if he stopped. As the weeks went on, faith in humanity began to crumble. The prisoners no longer saw the doctors as people. They were machines, moving with purpose, but without feeling. And yet, what haunted the men most was not the cruelty but the calm. The realization that every act of pain had been planned, measured, and justified in the name of science. In the final days of winter, as snow fell outside the barred windows, the surviving prisoners understood the truth. The cost of progress, for those who believed in it, was paid in flesh, and inside the hospital, science had claimed its price. The new officer arrived quietly one morning in February of 1945. No one knew his name at first. He wore the same uniform as the others, the same expressionless mask that all the doctors seemed to share. But there was something different about him. His movements were slower, his eyes softer, as if he was carrying a weight he couldn't put down. To the prisoners, he was just another face among the cold machinery of the hospital. Yet in time, he would become the first person to remind them that mercy had not been completely erased from the world. He was young, no older than 30, and the men would later learn his name was Dr. Ishida. He spoke little and observed much. He stood back during the experiments, watching with a kind of unease that none of the other doctors showed. When others took notes, he lingered. When others walked away, he stayed behind. At first, the prisoners thought he was just inexperienced, but then small things began to happen. One night, a prisoner who had been suffering from a fever woke to find a cool cloth pressed against his forehead. No guards were nearby, and the light from the hallway barely reached the bed. The man saw a figure kneeling beside him, placing a small tablet under his tongue before slipping back into the shadows. Over the next few weeks, similar moments followed. A few prisoners who had been marked for another round of testing found their names mysteriously removed from the list. Others noticed small bandages appearing on their wounds, as if someone had tended to them while they slept. These were small things, barely noticeable, yet in a place where kindness had been forgotten, they were miracles. The men began to whisper about the mysterious doctor, calling him the Silent One. They didn't dare speak his name aloud. Even a rumor of sympathy could bring punishment to both prisoner and officer alike. One evening, Sergeant Mitchell was summoned for an examination. His strength was fading, and the thought of another test made his stomach turn. But when he entered the room, it was Ishida who greeted him. The doctor did not meet his eyes. He simply checked his pulse, examined his wounds, and spoke in a quiet voice. "You must not let them see the infection," he said in halting English. "If they do, they will take you." Mitchell froze, unsure if it was a trick. But then Ishida pressed a small vial into his hand, its contents faintly glowing under the dim light. "For pain," the doctor whispered before calling the guard back. Mitchell never forgot that moment. The acts of kindness continued, always in secret. Ishida moved like a ghost, careful, calculated, never leaving evidence behind, but the risk was enormous. The other doctors began to notice small inconsistencies, missing supplies, altered records, unexplained results. The head physician grew suspicious and ordered tighter control over the medical staff. Ishida's hands began to shake when he worked, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds. One night, a storm swept across the compound, the wind howling against the walls. The guards were distracted, and Ishida took the chance to sneak into the prisoners' quarters. He carried a bundle of gauze, small pills, and 2 canteens of clean water. The men stared at him, unsure what to do. Ishida knelt beside them and said quietly, "I cannot stop them, but I can help you stay alive." For the first time in months, someone had spoken words that carried compassion, but mercy had a price. Days later, Ishida disappeared. The guards said nothing, but everyone in the hospital knew. His absence was proof of what kindness cost in a place built on cruelty. Yet even though he was gone, the prisoners felt something had changed. The silence that once filled the hospital was broken. They had seen humanity flicker, fragile and brief, but real. And in that flicker, they found the will to endure a little longer. By March of 1945, the hospital had become a machine that no one could stop. The doctors worked day and night, their experiments growing more desperate as the war turned against Japan. The prisoners had long since lost the illusion of survival. They knew now that there was no way to escape the experiments, no way to reason with the men who saw them as test subjects instead of human beings. The days were colder, the food thinner, and the silence heavier. Many of the prisoners stopped speaking altogether, their spirits worn down to nothing. But not all of them. Somewhere in the exhaustion, a few began to believe that dying on their own terms was better than dying on a table. The first spark of resistance came quietly. A man named Carter refused an injection. He clenched his fist and knocked the needle from the doctor's hand. The guards beat him for it. but something in his defiance lit a fire in the others. The next day, another man pretended to faint during an examination, buying time for the others to hide a few of the surgical tools that had been left out. They had no plan, not really, just a shared understanding that they would not die quietly. The doctors noticed the change almost immediately. They began increasing the guards, adding patrols in the corridors, checking each man before and after treatment. Fear returned, but now it came with anger. Mitchell watched it all unfold. He had always told the men to endure, to survive, but even he felt something shift inside him. The memory of Dr. Ishida's kindness lingered like a faint echo, but it was not enough anymore. The doctors had taken everything from them: names, strength, dignity, and now even their deaths were being stolen. One night, as the lights dimmed, Mitchell whispered to the others, "If they mean to end us, let us choose how it happens." The revolt began at dawn. The men had stolen a scalpel, a wrench, and a piece of broken glass. It was nothing against rifles, but it was something. When the guards entered the ward to collect the next group of test subjects, one prisoner lunged, slashing at a guard's face. Chaos exploded. Shouts filled the hallway, boots thundered against the floors, and gunfire echoed through the hospital. The prisoners knew they would not win. They were starving, weak, unarmed. But for a few minutes they were free, not in body, but in will. Mitchell saw two men fall before his eyes, their faces calm as if they had finally taken back control of their own fate. The rebellion was crushed within the hour. The surviving prisoners were dragged into the courtyard, their heads bowed under the glare of the rising sun. The hospital's commander stood before them, his voice cold and sharp. He announced that resistance would no longer be tolerated. For every act of defiance, 3 men would die. That morning, they made good on the threat. The sound of gunfire echoed beyond the walls, and then there was silence. After that day, the hospital grew even darker. The guards were merciless, the doctors crueler, the punishments relentless. The men who survived did so in silence, each one carrying the memory of those who had chosen to fight. Mitchell sat alone in his cell one night, staring at the blood-stained floor where his friends had stood. He thought of what the men had done, the choice they had made, and he realized something. The doctors could take their lives, but not their defiance. Even in death, they had proven one thing: the experiments might destroy the body, but the will to resist, even for a moment, could never be erased. By the summer of 1945, the sound of war had changed. The thunder of distant bombs that once echoed through the countryside was now closer, heavier, and the doctors inside the hospital could feel it closing in. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable was falling apart. Rumors spread through the camp that the Allied forces were advancing across the Pacific, pushing deeper into Japanese territory. The guards spoke in hushed tones, their discipline cracking. Some of them had already disappeared during the night, taking trucks and supplies and fleeing east. The hospital, once full of order and precision, now felt like a ghost of itself. The halls were quiet, the experiments fewer, the doctors tense. Even cruelty had grown tired. The prisoners could sense it too. The fear that had defined every day was slowly replaced by something they did not recognize. It wasn't hope exactly, but the faint awareness that the end was near. The guards stopped shouting as often. Meals came irregularly. Some of the medical staff vanished without explanation. When the morning roll call was skipped for the first time, the men began to whisper that maybe the Japanese were abandoning the camp. Sergeant Mitchell did not believe it at first, but on the 3rd day, without inspections, he noticed something. The gates were unguarded. The flags had been taken down. The hospital was still, like a stage waiting for the final scene. It happened on a grey morning in August. The sound of engines rumbled in the distance. Then came shouting, but it wasn't Japanese, it was English. The prisoners stumbled from their barracks, too weak to run, too afraid to believe it. The first Allied soldiers who entered the compound froze at what they saw. The men were thin as shadows, their eyes hollow, their skin covered in scars and bruises. The smell of decay hung in the air, and in the operating rooms, the soldiers found the truth of what had been done there. Tables stained with blood, shelves lined with jars holding things that should never have been preserved. It was not a hospital, it was evidence. The survivors were carried out on stretchers, their bodies wrapped in blankets. Some wept, others stared blankly into the sky, unable to process that they were free. Mitchell, barely able to walk, looked back once at the hospital before being loaded onto a truck. It stood silent, its windows shattered, its hallways empty. It looked harmless now, just another building. But he knew better. Inside those walls, humanity had been tested and found wanting. After the war ended, the survivors were sent home. Some spoke to investigators, giving testimony about the experiments, the doctors, the names they remembered. Others stayed silent, unable to relive what they had endured. Mitchell tried to rebuild his life, but the hospital followed him everywhere. He saw it in his dreams, in the sound of rain against a window, in the sight of white coats in a doctor's office. No matter how far he went, the memories stayed. Years later, during the war trials, the world learned the full truth. The experiments were revealed, the names of the doctors exposed, the photographs shown to the public. People gasped, cried, and condemned. But for the survivors, no amount of justice could undo what had been done. Mitchell once said that the hardest part wasn't surviving the pain. It was surviving the memory of kindness twisted into cruelty, of science turned into a weapon. In the end, the hospital was burned to the ground, its ruins buried under new soil. But beneath that soil lay more than ashes. It held the proof that war could corrupt even those sworn to heal, and that some wounds would never truly close. For the men who walked out of that place, freedom was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a lifetime spent trying to remember how to feel human again.